And I learned the incredible lesson. When a little church gets to work together, God shows up and God produces the most amazing results.
I had the wonderful privilege of growing up in a pastor's home, and as you might imagine, going every week to see my father preaching on Sundays and being a pastor, my favorite game to play as I grew up as a child was church. And my brother Tom, who was just a year younger than me, the two of us would conduct church services in our bedroom. We had a bunk bed, and we would climb up to the top bunk, and Tom would be the worship leader, and I would be the preacher. Tom agreed to let me always be the preacher. He said, you can be the preacher if you want. He said, when we go to heaven, they won't need preachers anymore. But he said they'll still need worshipers, and he was looking for a management position when he got to heaven. So he would be the worship leader, and we would invite our mother to come and be the congregation because we knew that she needed a lot of church. And so we would put one chair in our little floor space of our bedroom. We would have our mother seated, and then Tom would begin by making some preliminary announcements and saying, immediately after the service today, we'll be having a potluck ice cream fellowship. We hope that everyone will bring something. And then we would begin singing, and Tom would lead us in singing all the children's songs that we knew. And my mother would sing away with all of her heart and enthusiastically. And then once we had exhausted our musical repertoire, he would say, now our pastor is going to come and deliver God's word to us today. And I would get up, and I had a children's Bible that I preached from, and I had some actual rudimentary sermon notes that I preached from. I only had developed one sermon, though, so I always preached the same one, but I preached it with zeal. I preached it with a sense of urgency and conviction, and it was entitled, The Sin of Spanking Your Children. And as I would warm to my theme, I would say, there may be some here today who have committed this horrible sin against God and against your own flesh and blood, and even now the Spirit of God is convicting you and pleading with you to turn back from your wicked and evil ways. And I would just feel compelled to extend an altar call at the end of that moving message. And when no one walked the aisle immediately, I would say, now folks, we're not in any hurry today. We're just going to continue to sing until everyone has had the opportunity to be made right with God. And eventually, to bring closure to that experience, my mother would walk the aisle and rededicate her life, promising God that she would be a better mother in the future. And we would then dismiss the service and go have ice cream. And unfortunately, it never took all that long for our mother to backslide and on our backsides, and we would have to have another service. I remember after a particularly unpleasant week of discipline, my brother coming to me and saying, Richard, these occasional church services just are not producing life change in Mom. I think she needs a whole revival meeting or something. But as children, going through the motions of preaching and making announcements and singing songs, we discovered early on that there's more to church than just that. And it's not just about what happens on Sunday, but the church is a living organism. It's something that God Himself has designed and put together in a very unique way, unlike any other grouping of people you'll ever experience. God is the author of the church, and He has placed His Son, Jesus Christ, to be the head of the church, and Jesus Himself said that He would take personal responsibility for building His church. This unit you've been studying about the church and how it functions. And I want to just underline for you two very simple truths that we have to continue to remember whenever we think about the church. And the first one is simply this, that God is the one who puts the church together. He is the one who builds the church. And there's a wonderful verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 18, where Scripture there says that God is the one who adds members to the body as it pleases Him. And so as a pastor, I was always asking myself, What else has God placed in our church? How has He equipped us? I remember at one point a man rose up in one of our business meetings and just shared and said, I'm just burdened about the fact that we don't have a camping ministry. He said, I grew up as a young man, and some of the greatest moments in my Christian life occurred while I was at camp. And he said, none of the churches in our whole association have camps, and I'm just burdened about that. Now let me just share a caution to you. When you're at church, we don't respond necessarily to every whim and thought that anyone has. Just because someone says, I think we should do this, you don't necessarily run after everything someone says. But when I sensed that a person had sincerely heard from the Lord, and they weren't trying to push anything themselves, they weren't trying to lift themselves up, they just truly had a burden, I would let them share with the rest of the body. And I'd watch to see what the Spirit of God did. If someone shared, I think we should do this, and no one else seemed to feel that way, I would take that as a caution that that was not something that the Spirit of God was affirming in our body. But when I had this man stand up and start talking about camping, all of a sudden I could just sense the Spirit of God just electrifying people all over that little group. One woman immediately said, I would be willing to take a week's vacation and be the camp nurse. Someone else said, I could be the camp cook. People said, if you just tell me the dates, I'll be a counselor. And you could just tell that it was resonating with everybody there in the church. It became one of the most successful ministries that church had. Every year, people found Christ and were baptized. We had parents who would just go out to visit the camp one evening and end up coming for baptism as a result of what they experienced. It was a wonderful ministry, and it came not because of the pastor's plan. It came because I just kept asking people, what do you sense God is wanting to do? What has God put in your heart? And why is He giving you that burden? Maybe there's others here in the body that will come around this and minister. Well, I was getting so excited about this that every time I would visit someone, one of the first things I would ask was, what has God placed in your heart? And I remember going to visit one couple that had just begun visiting our church. And I sat down in their living room and I said, turned to the husband and I asked him, I said, now, what are you really passionate about right now? What is it that you just get all excited about? What is it that just is important in your life and that you're bringing with you as you come into our church family? And he looked at me and a big smile came on his face and he said, I'm really excited and passionate about barefoot water skiing. Now, I thought, okay, God, this one's up to you. I don't know how barefoot water skiing is going to build the kingdom of God. I said, is there anything else in your life that perhaps is not quite as exciting to you as barefoot water skiing, but still you think about a lot? He said, no, I'm just consumed with barefoot water skiing. I said, well, we want to welcome you to our fellowship. We'll just let God show us how He can take something as bizarre as that and use it for His kingdom. Well, you know, the interesting thing is that the barefoot water skier met and got to know the man that was leading the camp ministry and found out that the lake where the camp was held was a lake that he often went to with his high-powered speedboat and did water skiing. And so he asked if he could come out with some of his friends and give a demonstration to all the teenage campers one week and then give lessons to any of the teenagers who wanted to learn how to ski. It was the highlight of the entire week. We had a bunch of kids there who never went to church normally, and their parents, who were not Christians or churchgoers, were calling the church the next Monday trying to already book their kids for the following year's camp because their children could not stop talking about how wonderful that experience was. That barefoot water skier discovered he loved working with kids and ultimately became a Sunday school teacher because he said, I can't wait for a whole year for the next opportunity to work with kids. And for years afterward, he was a faithful teacher. God took someone with a passion for barefoot water skiing, added him to a body, and people began to find Christ and to be encouraged and built up as a result. I could just tell you many, many stories of those churches who began to understand that God was fashioning His body so that it could be His instrument in redeeming a lost world. I was in a church one time and a couple of the staff people came to me and they said, they were in a larger church, and they said, we began to be convicted that we would just ask people to come and just support our programs and to give their money to support all of our efforts and endeavors. And they said, we looked out over all those people in our church and we began to ask ourselves, do we even know what God has placed in our own church? There are all kinds of talents and backgrounds and skills that we don't even know about, because we just say, well, here we need someone to pass out a bulletin on Sunday mornings. We need somebody to work in the nursery during the service. But we've never stopped to say, God, who have you given to us? Who is a part of our body? So they formed a survey. And they passed out a form to every member and said, what has God placed in your life that you would be willing to place on the altar for God and let Him use it any way that He would choose to? Well, they had all kinds of wonderful things come back. One retired man, his dream in life was, when he retired, was to buy a Cadillac. So he had retired, he'd gotten his final retirement sort of severance package, and he bought his dream car. He loved to drive that car, but to be honest, he was feeling a little guilty. Now he's retired, he's just driving around in this nice car. So God convicted him, he needed to put that on the altar. And so he told the church, if there's ever a shut-in that needs to get a ride to a doctor's appointment, maybe there's a single mother, and she can't get to the school to pick her child up, or just let me know, and I'll shuttle them. Well, all of a sudden, the church had a limo service. And this man was just thrilled. He loved to drive his Cadillac, loved to just minister to folks. It appeased a lot of his guilt for having this nice car. But now the church, if someone would call in distress, I'm stuck in the doctor's office, my child's going to be out of school, and I won't be there to pick him up, they'd say, don't worry, we'll get the limo, we'll send it out. And the church had a wonderful service that way. The other people put their guest rooms and cottages at the lake, and various things that God had given them in their hands. They said, if our church can make use of this for the kingdom, we want the church to use that. Well, things were going very well for them until one day these staff people that were telling me this story said it got a little complicated, because we got a form from a widow in our church. And this widow said, I have been praying earnestly about what I could put on the altar for God to use here in my church. And I knew it had to be something of great value to me, something very important to me. And I asked myself, what is it I treasure and value more than anything else in my life? And she finally decided it was her cat. And she said, so I want to put my cat on the altar for God. At first, the staff said, we didn't know what to do with that. What do you do with someone's cat? I mean, what is the church going to do with that? They said, we didn't know. We thought we would better take this seriously. At first, we weren't even sure if maybe she was just joking with us or not, but they said, oh, we can't risk that. So finally, they called a meeting. What else do you do when you don't know what to do? They called a meeting at the church, and they said, if any of you have pets, and you would like to place your pet in God's service here in our church, would you come to this meeting on Sunday night? They had over 40 people show up. There were people that had snakes and birds and fish and dogs and cats and horses. They didn't all bring their pets to the meeting, but they all represented various animals, and they were passionate about those animals. They loved those pets. And as they're all talking, you can just imagine, as everyone's looking around, saying, now, why would God put all these pet lovers together in a room in our church like this? Finally, someone said, you know, every morning when I go to work, I drive right past an orphanage. And when I come home every day, I see all these kids out in the yard, and it just struck me the other day, I bet you none of them have pets. You probably can't have pets there in the orphanage, and no child should grow up without at least having exposure to a pet. He said, I'd be willing just to call those people and see if they'd be willing to let some of us bring our pets over and let those kids play with them. Well, he called, and sure enough, they were delighted. And before long, the church was bringing over all kinds of pets. Those kids would play with them after school. Then they found a children's hospital that was willing for certain pets to come in, and for those kids who were struggling to play with some of those gentle animals. And they even found a hospice where people were placed who were near death, and they'd find these little lap animals, dogs and cats, that would just lie there and be petted and just give that warmth of another living thing there in their lap. And this church developed buttons and T-shirts, and they developed a whole pet ministry. And they said people began to know our church. You're that animal church, aren't you, that has all those animals? And the staff told me it is the greatest single outreach our church has today. And they said it was because a widow in our church offered her cat into God's service. And God used that for His kingdom. Have you ever asked yourself how God is equipping your church? What has He put in your church? He's doing it for a reason. He has a purpose for that. Secondly, just to mention for a moment, not only does God build up His church, but He also makes the body interconnected. In verse 26, Paul wrote, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. The sign that you are a healthy church body is how fast it takes for one person to hurt and another person to feel the pain. If people can hurt in isolation in a church, it means the healthy is not healthy. You know what that's like when you drop something on your toe? How long does it take for your brain to feel the pain? It's instantaneous, isn't it? Because every part of your body is connected. And when one part of the body hurts, the rest hurts. When one part rejoices, the rest rejoices. And Paul was saying, healthy bodies feel the pain one with the other. I'll never forget when I was a college student. I was going to university. I went to an evening service at our church, and I went and sat down and was just waiting for the service to begin. And I was kind of looking around to see who else was coming in, and I noticed over on the far side of the auditorium an elderly widow sitting there. And this woman had lost her husband the previous fall, and she was there in church faithfully as she always was. And all of a sudden, I just sensed the Spirit of God drawing me to think about her for a moment. And it was as if God just said, Mrs. Clark's husband has passed away. It's the springtime now. And I've been listening to lawnmowers going. I've been watching people working their yard. And it was as if God just simply asked me, who do you think is going to take care of Mrs. Clark's yard? Her husband had done all those kinds of things before. She didn't even know where the lawnmower was in her house. I thought to myself, as God was prompting me to consider this, I thought, well, I don't know who's going to take care of her yard. Probably the deacons will check on that. And I just continued to sit there waiting for the service to start. But I felt a compulsion that I should find out who should take care of her yard. I thought to myself, well, God, I can't find out now. The service is about to start, and I have to prepare to worship you. And I almost sense God saying, I can wait. Go find out who's going to take care of her yard. So finally I got up, made my way around to the other side of the auditorium, and I sat down next to Mrs. Clark for a moment. I said, Mrs. Clark, I was just wondering, tonight as I was thinking about you, I said, who's going to do your yard work for you? Who's going to take care of all those things, the tree limbs that have fallen down to the yard? And I'll never forget the look that she gave me. She was a wonderful British lady. And when she lost her husband, she was the kind of person who just absolutely did not want to be a burden to anyone. So she had not told the church, she had not put in any requests. She was not going to be a burden just because she was a widow. She was going to find some way to take care of things, but she didn't know how to do that. And so she had been praying earnestly every day, God, would you help me? I don't know what to do, but I don't want to be a burden to my church. They have so many other important things to do. And all of a sudden, here's this lanky college student saying, God just impressed me. I need to ask you, who's going to take care of your yard? She said, I don't know, but I've been praying for God to send someone. I said, I'll be there on Saturday. I went over there and had to dust off her lawnmower and clean it all out, and there had been branches falling all through the winter and spring all over her yard. It was a huge task. And I cleaned it up and put things away. And as I was mowing the yard, just on the last little bit of her side of her house, I saw her come out, and she had a little handful of money. She was not going to be anyone's debtor. She was going to pay me for what I had done. And as I was sort of putting the lawnmower away, she came up with a little handful of money I knew was so precious to her. And I don't tell you this story to make me sound like a saint, because I wasn't one. I just clearly knew what God wanted me to do. I just said, Mrs. Clark, I'm just telling you, I cannot take your money. It would just be wrong for me. Now, I'm not averse to receiving money, but I can't take it from you. I just know it'd be wrong. I said, I've just enjoyed doing this for you, and I'll come every week during the summer and take care of your yard. But I said, I'm not a complete saint. I said, I do know that you like to bake. And I said, anytime you're baking any of those incredible cinnamon pastries or anything else, just if you want to bring a few by with me, I've got 3 roommates, we'd be happy to receive them. Well, that was on a Saturday. The next morning I went to church. I walked into the foyer of the church, and I thought I'd walked into a bakery. Everybody was buzzing. They thought that there was a potluck supper no one had told them about. The place just was filled with wonderful smells of baking. She had baked all Saturday evening and had brought in just a tray load full of baking. And as soon as she spotted me coming in the door, she brought me over and pointed and said, "Oh, that's for you. There'll be more next week." She said, I was voted roommate of the century by all my roommates. And for the rest of that summer, this university student and that widow developed a wonderful relationship. How does a widow and a 20-year-old college student get linked together that way? Well, God puts them in the same body. And when a widow's hurting, the college students feel the pain. That's what a healthy body does. If we're not feeling that way, or if a church has found that it has lost a lot of members and people have left upset, or the church is divided, do you understand what that does to a body that God has designed? Every inactive member in your church is someone God knew that church needed to effectively do all that God had designed it to do. Every person now that no longer attends or serves is someone God knew that church needed to accomplish all that God intended for it. We're all to be a part of a body. And if we're not a part of a body that is healthy, that is serving together and using each person as God has placed them in the body to extend His work and His kingdom, then we need to review once again and say, God, why did you add me to this body? What is it you've placed me here for? And Lord, am I connected with others in such a way that if there's ever someone here who needs to be encouraged or is hurting, Lord, would you help me to feel that pain so that I can be a part of your answer in their life?
In 1993, we were still a small church, about 150 people worshiping together on a Sunday. And we did an evangelism training course, and we were having a barbecue after Sunday lunch. And these folk were really excited about reaching their neighbors for Christ. And somebody said, how can we do it? And we said, well, maybe we can rent time on a local radio station, because in South Africa at that time, the government owned all the radio stations. And so the government regulated radio. And somebody said, well, you know, I've heard that our government, we're still in apartheid South Africa, is looking at deregulating radio. So I wrote a very faithless letter off to the government saying, we're going to do some evangelism, and would you allow us to broadcast those services for 2 hours, for 7 nights, just to the valley area, about a 3-mile circumference. And I got a fax back from the government 3 weeks before we had asked for the date to start, to say, you have been granted South Africa's very first Christian FM station. And you're going to broadcast to the greatest city of Cape Town, which has got nearly 3 million people in, 24 hours a day. I mean, I couldn't even spell the word radio. 3 weeks later, we opened South Africa's very first Christian FM station. Do you know, the whole church took leave. For 6 or 7 weeks, I didn't have a single problem. Nobody fought. I didn't need to do any pastoral counseling, because they were all so busy serving God, they were too busy to fight. They were too busy serving God and seeing God at work and celebrating what God was doing. And I learned the incredible lesson. When a little church gets to work together, God shows up. And God produces the most amazing results. The station grew, and out of that station has now come an organization which is local church driven, called Radio Africa Network, and we've helped plant 29 stations around Africa as a local church. But we soon needed a new building. The little Sunday school house wasn't really great. And so I said to our radio station treasurer, how much money have we got? And she said to me in those terms, about $1,000. Now, $1,000 doesn't buy a building. And we saw an ideal building to move this radio station to. It was perfect in every way. 3 floors, perfectly positioned. Everything was right about it. Except one problem, the price. That was the only problem. That Sunday, it had been prearranged to have a little old lady in our church who lived in a retirement center, and she lived in a room that would maybe be 9 foot by 9 foot. And we're talking at lunchtime about this building down the road that's just so great. And this little old lady who lived in the most humble of rooms put her knife and fork down and reached over for her purse, and said, God just told me to give you $1,500. I mean, I didn't even know she had money. I said to my wife, let's have a back to lunch tomorrow. I walked out of there, and I shared with somebody else, we had this dear lady to lunch, and she gave us $1,500. And he said, well, John, that's a strange thing, because I just did a business deal and I made $1,500 and I didn't know what to do with it. So here's your second $1,500. And before that weekend was up, we had about $4,500, and we hadn't told a soul publicly or said, this is a need. Talk about a confirmation that God wanted us to get this building. Now, that was early December, and in South Africa, our summer vacation is in December. And our schools break up for the long summer vacation early December. It so felt after that God also went on summer vacation. Because for 3 weeks we trusted God. I mean, we've had one weekend of glorious provision, and then the heavens were as brass. God wasn't answering prayers anymore. Finally, 2 days before Christmas, I called our church to prayer, and I said, 3 weeks ago, God confirmed that we were to buy this building. And since then, God has not shown up. That was on a Sunday. Now, the Saturday, the day before, I'd got a phone call from the radio station, and they said, there's somebody here who wants to meet you. And I said, who's this guy? And I'll call him Peter. And they said, Peter. And I said, Peter who? And they said, well, we don't know. But he's insistent he wants to meet you. So I went down to the station and I met with this man who I'd never met, never heard of before. And he said, I read about you, and I'm now on vacation in South Africa, and I read about you in a radio newsletter in the States, so I wanted to meet you. And he looked around, he said, this building's pretty small, isn't it? So I said, yeah, there's a building down the road we're trusting God to be able to buy. And he said, take me to it. And it was heavy summer traffic. We're right on the beach, right at the very tip of Africa. And we drove there in the traffic and literally did an about turn, a U-turn in front of the building, and drove straight back. And he got out of his car, and his son was there to take him away. And that was the last I heard of him. Sunday, I said to the church, we've got to pray. And so the people stayed behind after the service. And one solid, long-standing, godly, grey-haired, bald-haired man got up and he said, Pastor, God is calling us as a church to launch out into the deep. You got to make an offer on that building. A godly, ordinary person. So on Tuesday night, I met with one of our trustees, and we found out that the real estate agent was in fact a Jewish person. And in our country, when you make an offer on a building, you have to give certain guarantees. This is the truth before God. I crossed out the guarantee clause, and I wrote there, we will endeavor to trust God to supply the balance of funding before the 1st of February. And I had no clue where that was going to come from. This Jewish estate agent says to me, what sort of an offer is that? How can I take that to my client? And I said to him, sir, that is the offer. And we're going to trust God to supply the balance of funding. Well, we put down our $5,000 that had come in the first 2 days as a deposit. I drove home and my telephone was ringing, and I ran into the house and grabbed the phone, and on the line was this guy who I'd met on Saturday. We were needing about $100,000 to buy this building. And he said, John, I've been trying to get hold of you, and I've actually left your country. I'm in another country now. I've been trying to get hold of you since Saturday to tell you God has put it on my heart to give you $80,000 towards that radio station building. And I said to him, Peter, God had to make me wait until I had signed for the building. I said, I've signed for it 5 minutes ago. And God tested me. And until I took the launch into the deep and signed the offer, God wasn't going to come through. within minutes, the offer came through and the money came through. And he said, when do you need the money by? And I said, the 1st of February. And he said, the money will be in the bank on the 1st of February. Well, I went out of there and I told the world, guess what? God has come through. I mean, I phoned the agent. I said, 10 minutes ago, I said to you, God was going to come through. And he has. And he says, oh, great. Can you get me a written guarantee on that? Yeah, look, I'm sure the money will be in the bank. Well, the lawyers start to get involved. I want to confirm all this. So now you tell me that you've got this guy. Do you know his name and his last name? No, I don't. Do you know where he lives? No, I don't. Do you have a fax number, a phone number? I don't. So the lawyer says, so you mean to tell me that a guy you've never met before, whose first name is the only name you know, who you have not spent longer than an hour with, is going to put the money in the account, but you don't know where he is and anything like that? I said, that's it. Well, the 31st of January came and I phoned the bank 3 times and there was no money in the bank. And for the first time, I got a little nervous. And I came into my office on the 1st of February, rather worried. And at 8:20 in the morning, the phone rang. It was the bank. She said to me, Reverend Thomas, a lot of money has just come into your bank account. When we had finished paying the bills, 24 South African cents were left in our bank account. That is 3 or 4 US cents. And I'm still wondering where we were undercharged by 4 US cents. That is the truth before God. We've kept the bank book. Because you see, we're just an ordinary church. We're just the little church down the road. We don't have thousands of people with millionaires. How does an ordinary church with ordinary people see God at work? They trust Him. They risk for God even when it's scary.